The air in room 734 was a study in absence. It did not smell of anything, did not taste of anything, did not hold the memory of sunlight or rain. It was a sterile, recycled medium designed for breathing and nothing more, scrubbed of all particulates, all pollens, all personality. Ilian existed within this controlled void, his life measured not in days or years, but in nutrient cycles and biometric reports. The walls were a seamless, matte white that drank the light from the recessed ceiling panels, leaving no shadows, no place for the eye to rest and imagine. The floor was the same, cool and unforgiving against the thin soles of his standard issue slippers. His world was a bleached bone, hollowed out and scoured clean. He knew, in a distant academic way, that this was not normal. He had access to the facility's archival data streams, a privilege afforded to him because a stimulated mind was a stable asset. He had seen images of the outside, sprawling forests choked with green, oceans that thrashed with an impossible blue, skies bruised with the colors of sunset. He had read poetry that spoke of the scent of damp earth after a storm, of wood smoke clinging to wool, of salt on the wind. These concepts were phantoms, beautiful but incomprehensible, like a language he could read but never speak. His own senses were muted, intentionally blunted by the daily regimen of suppressants and neutralizers that dripped into his system through the port just below his collarbone. They kept him calm. They kept him compliant. They kept him blank. He was Subject 734, a biological asset of the Enclave, and his value was predicated on his purity, his isolation from the chaotic variables of the organic world. He was not a person. He was a project. He traced the faint, geometric pattern of the thermal regulator on the wall, his finger leaving no print, no trace of his passing. The touch was muted, the sensation a dull pressure rather than a texture. Sometimes he would press his palms flat against the wall, trying to feel the vibration of the machinery that kept his world running, the deep, thrumming heart of his cage. It was the only proof that something existed beyond his own soft breathing. This morning, however, something was different. It was a change so subtle it was almost subliminal, a single discordant note in a symphony of perfect silence. It began not as a sound or a sight, but as a feeling deep within his chest, a flicker of warmth in a place that had been cold for as long as he could remember. He sat on the edge of his sleep slab, the synthetic fabric cool against his skin, and focused on the sensation. It was like the ghost of a memory he'd never had, a premonition. He closed his eyes, a useless gesture in a room with no variation in light, and tried to chase the feeling. The air shifted. That was it. The sterile, characterless air had changed. It now carried a new element, something infinitesimally small but profoundly alien. It was a scent, a real one, faint, acrid, like metal subjected to immense heat, and beneath it, something else, something sharp and mineral. Ozone. He knew the word from a technical schematic on atmospheric purifiers. The scent was a sign of failure, a breach in the system. His heart, a placid and well-regulated organ, began to beat with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. A tremor ran through the floor, a low-frequency vibration that was not the familiar hum of the facility. It was a shudder, deep and violent, as if the foundations of his world were being shaken apart. The recessed lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into an absolute disorienting darkness. For the first time in his recorded existence, Ilian was truly in the dark. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the placid fog of his medicated state. His breath hitched. The darkness was not an absence of light. It was a presence, a heavy blanket that smothered him. And in that suffocating dark, the scent grew stronger. Ozone and something else now. Dust, the scent of shattered composites, of pulverized rockcrete, the scent of destruction. A high-pitched whine began to build in the walls, the sound of failing systems and stressed metal. Then came a sound he had only ever heard in historical recordings, an explosion. It was not the clean, contained sound from the archives. It was a raw, guttural roar that ripped through the facility, a physical force that slammed into his room, making the very air vibrate with its power. He felt it in his teeth, in his bones. He scrambled back on the slab, pressing himself against the wall, his muted senses screaming with a sudden, painful influx of information. Red light flooded the room, pulsing in time with a blaring siren. The emergency protocols. The white walls were now painted a bloody, rhythmic crimson. The door to his room, a seamless panel he had never seen open from his side, hissed and slid away, revealing a corridor in chaos. Smoke, thick and black, billowed down the hall, carrying with it the smell of fire, of chemicals he could not name, and something else, something dark and coppery that made his stomach clench. The air was alive, thick with new sensations, each one a needle against his sheltered nerves. He could smell fear. He did not know how he knew, but the sharp, sour tang in the air was the scent of panic, of bodies pushed past their limits. Another explosion, closer this time, sent a shower of ceiling panels and wiring crashing to the floor just meters from his doorway. Through the haze, he saw figures running, their white lab coats stained with soot and blood. Their faces were masks of terror. They were not calm. They were not controlled. They were animals fleeing a fire. And then he saw them, the attackers. They moved through the smoke like wraiths, clad in matte black armor that absorbed the pulsing red light. They were not from the Enclave. Their movements were too fluid, too economical, their forms radiating a silent, predatory competence that was utterly alien to the sterile, academic world he knew. They carried weapons that spat compressed energy with vicious, silent coughs, and the Enclave's security forces, with their clumsy, kinetic round sidearms, fell before them like dolls. One of the figures turned its helmeted head in his direction. Elian froze, his body locked in a primal terror he had never been allowed to feel. The figure's visor was a plate of opaque black, hiding all humanity. But he felt its gaze land on him, a tangible weight. It raised its weapon. Time seemed to stretch, the pulsing red lights slowing to a languid, terrifying beat. He saw the weapon's charging coils glow. He was going to die. He had lived his entire life in a box, and he was going to die at its threshold. But then, a new sensation cut through the fear, a sharp, stinging pain in his neck just below the port. He reached up, his fingers fumbling, and felt a small, metallic dart, a tranquilizer. His vision began to swim, the red lights blurring into soft, hazy clouds. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him again was not the black-armored soldier, but one of the Enclave's own doctors, a woman with a desperate, apologetic look in her eyes, holding a dart launcher. She had shot him. Not them. Her. As his consciousness frayed, a single, coherent thought broke through the fog, a piece of a conversation he had overheard, a phrase that had meant nothing until now. Contingency. If the asset is compromised, activate the final protocol. Deny it to them, at any cost. They weren't trying to save him. They were trying to erase him. Kale stood on the precipice of the ridge, the wind a living thing that tore at his cloak and whipped strands of black hair across his face. Below, nestled in the sterile grey valley like a surgical scar on the landscape, was the Enclave's Cytos 7 research facility. It was a monument to order, a fortress of clean lines and stark functionality, and Kyle felt a familiar, cold contempt for it. His world was one of wind and rock and the scent of pine on the air, a world of instinct and survival. The Enclave sought to scrub the world clean of such things, to replace the messy, unpredictable pulse of life with the sterile hum of a machine. They were a cancer of control, and he was the blade sent to cut a piece of it out. He was not a savior. He was a weapon, the alpha of the Blackwood Pack, a title that carried the weight of blood and iron. He had earned it not through lineage but through strength, by being colder, faster, and more ruthless than any who challenged him. His pack was not a family born of warmth and affection. It was a forged alliance of survivors, outcasts, and rebels, all of them bound by a shared hatred for the systemic control of the enclaves that dotted the continent. They fought for freedom, but Kale fought for something simpler: balance. The enclave's obsession with genetic purity and emotional suppression was an imbalance that nature itself would one day correct. He was merely an agent of that correction. His second, Reese, materialized at his side, moving with the silent grace of a predator. All teams are in position, Alpha. The perimeter schematics were accurate. They are blind to our approach. Kyle didn't turn. His gaze remained fixed on the facility, his senses extending, tasting the air. He could smell the recycled oxygen venting from the purifiers, a scent as sterile and dead as the ideology it served. The objective? Kale's voice was low, rough like stones grinding together. It was a voice that gave orders and expected them to be obeyed without question. Reese's own voice was steady, a reflection of his alpha's calm. Subject 734. Geneticists believe it's the core of their Serenity project, an omega of unprecedented psychic and pheromonal purity. They've spent 2 decades cultivating it. The word hung in the air, cold and clinical. The Enclave saw the omega as a thing, a tool, a biological weapon capable of pacifying entire populations with a pheromonal wave, a living tool for their campaign of total emotional control. Kyle's pack saw it as something else, a threat to be neutralized, or an asset to be repurposed. The directive from the council is clear, Reese continued, his tone carefully neutral. Secure the asset. If extraction is compromised. He paused. Kyle finished the thought for him, his voice devoid of emotion. Deny it to the enemy. Bring me its head. The words were brutal, but in their world, sentiment was a luxury that led to extinction. An asset of that power could not be allowed to remain in the Enclave's hands. If they could not take it, they would destroy it. It was simple, brutal logic. He was a creature of that logic. He had been raised in the ruins of the old world, taught that emotion was a weakness the Enclaves exploited. Control was strength, control of self, control of one's pack, control of the mission. He had bled for that control, had sacrificed parts of himself to maintain it. He felt no rage, no hatred for the people he was about to kill. They were merely obstacles, system components that needed to be removed. He raised a hand, the gesture economical and precise. Across the ridge, black-clad figures rose from the scrub and rock, their forms blending with the shadows. They were a force of nature, as silent and deadly as a winter frost. "Begin the assault," Kyle commanded. The word was barely a whisper, yet it carried across the wind to every member of his team through their comms. He watched as the first charges breached the facility's outer wall, not with a loud, chaotic explosion, but with a focused, implosive concussion that swallowed sound. A clean, surgical cut. His team flowed into the breach like smoke, their movements a testament to years of brutal training. Kyle descended the ridge, his long strides eating up the rocky terrain. He moved with a predatory grace, his body a perfectly honed instrument of violence. He did not rush. He did not need to. The outcome was already decided. Inside, the facility was transforming from a place of sterile order to a charnel house. The pulsing red emergency lights cast his armored form in demonic shades as he moved through the corridors. The air, once clean, was now thick with the stench of cordite, burnt plastic, and blood. The Enclave's security was pathetic, their movements clumsy, their fear a palpable scent in the air. They were scientists and bureaucrats playing at being soldiers. Kyle and his pack were wolves among sheep. He moved past the bodies without a glance. They were not people. They were variables that had been eliminated. His focus was singular, absolute. Subject 734. His helmet's HUD highlighted the path, a glowing green line leading him deeper into the heart of the complex, toward the high-security genetics wing. The comm crackled in his ear. "Alpha, we have heavy resistance near the primary lab. They've initiated containment protocols." "Breach it," Kyle said simply. There was no other option. A moment later, the sound of a controlled explosion echoed from deeper within the facility. The path was clear. He arrived at a reinforced door marked with the designation Lab G7. Beyond it was a smaller, circular chamber with a single sealed room at its center. Room 734, the asset's containment cell. A handful of lab-coated scientists stood before it, armed with woefully inadequate sidearms. One of them, a woman with terror in her eyes, held a dart launcher. Kyle registered her presence, catalogued her as a threat, but his attention was drawn to the doorway of the cell. Through the smoke, he saw a figure, small, slender, clad in the simple white tunic of an Enclave subject. The pulsing red light washed over pale skin and wide, disoriented eyes. The asset. It looked young, frightened. For a flicker of a second, a ghost of an unfamiliar emotion stirred within him. He crushed it instantly. It was not a person. It was an objective. He raised his rifle, the targeting laser painting a small, precise red dot on the subject's chest. The woman with the dart launcher fired, but not at him. She fired at the subject. A final, desperate act of denial. The figure crumpled, its movements slow and drugged. Kyle felt a flicker of annoyance. A tranquilized asset would be more difficult to transport. He stepped forward, his weapon still trained on the unconscious form, ignoring the scientists who were now dropping their own weapons in surrender. The mission was almost complete. He just needed to secure the package. As he drew closer, he noticed the air around the subject was shimmering. A strange, almost invisible distortion. And then he smelled it. It was faint, almost lost beneath the acrid sense of battle. But it was there. A scent that defied all description. It was not floral, not musky, not sweet. It was like starlight given fragrance, like the silence between notes of music, like the color of water in a deep well. It was a scent that spoke of things he had never known, but had always, in the deepest, most primal part of his being, yearned for. It bypassed his logic, his training, his ironclad control. It slid past the walls he had built around his soul and struck him directly in the heart of his alpha nature. The world tilted on its axis. And for the first time in his life, Kale felt his knees weaken. The world returned to Elian in pieces, a fractured mosaic of pain and confusion. The first thing he registered was the texture of the floor against his cheek, cold, gritty, and real. The sensation was so sharp, so distinct from the seamless surfaces of his room, that it was a shock to his system. He groaned, a sound that felt foreign in his own throat, and tried to push himself up. His limbs were heavy, unresponsive, the lingering effects of the tranquilizer turning his muscles to lead. The second thing he registered was the scent. The air was no longer a neutral medium. It was a thick, complex tapestry of smells that overwhelmed his newly awakened senses. Smoke, blood, the sharp tang of ozone, and underneath it all, a scent that was both terrifying and intoxicating. It smelled of power, of pine needles crushed underfoot, of cold mountain air and leather, and a deep, resonant musk that spoke of dominance and safety all at once. It was the scent of an alpha, a powerful one. Panic, a raw and unfamiliar instinct, seized him. He forced his eyes open. The pulsing red lights were gone, replaced by the stark, flickering glare of a portable floodlight set up in the corridor. The chaos had subsided, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. The bodies of the Enclave's security and staff were still there, stark reminders of the violence that had torn through his world. And standing over him, a titan in black armor, was the source of the scent, the soldier from before, the one who had moved like a wraith through the smoke. His helmet was off now, clipped to his belt, and Elian found himself staring up at the face of the man who had been sent to capture or kill him. He was younger than Elian had imagined, perhaps not yet 30, but his face was hard, carved from granite and experience. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes the color of a stormy sky, intense and piercing. A scar, thin and white, cut through one dark eyebrow, a permanent mark of violence. He was the embodiment of the world Elian had only read about, a world of sharp edges and real consequences, the Alpha. The scent rolling off him in waves was suffocating, a declaration of power that made every nerve in Elian's body scream in submission. This was a predator, and he was prey. He tried to scramble backward, to put any distance between himself and this terrifying presence. But his body wouldn't obey. His movements were clumsy, pathetic. The Alpha watched him, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold control. But his scent told a different story. Beneath the powerful musk of dominance, there was a tremor of something else, confusion, shock, a strange, raw note of reverence. It made no sense. The Alpha took a step closer, and Elian flinched, curling into himself. He was an asset, an objective, a thing to be taken or destroyed. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the killing blow, for the cold finality of the mission being completed. He heard the clink of armor, the soft crunch of debris under a heavy boot. The Alpha was right over him now. He could feel the heat radiating from his body. But the blow never came. Instead, he heard a sharp intake of breath. He felt a subtle shift in the air, in the very pressure of the room. Slowly, cautiously, he opened his eyes. And the world stopped making sense. The Alpha, the cold and ruthless killer, the commander of the force that had just torn his home apart, was on one knee. His head was bowed, his powerful form, which had seemed to fill the entire corridor, now folded in on itself in a gesture of profound submission. His gaze was fixed on Elian, but the predatory intensity was gone, replaced by a look of raw, incredulous awe. It was the look of a man seeing the sun for the first time. It was impossible. Alphas did not kneel, not to anyone, especially not to a frightened, drugged Omega from a lab. Elian's own scent, he realized with a jolt, was pouring out of him, no longer held in check by the suppressants. It felt wild, untamed, a part of him he had never known, now unleashed and broadcasting his nature to the world. It was a scent he himself could barely process, a complex blend of something like night-blooming jasmine, rain-washed stone, and a faint, sweet trace of honeyed tea. It was the scent of his own fear, his confusion, his very essence. And this alpha, this creature of logic and violence, was kneeling in it, breathing it in as if it were the only air in the world. A voice, rough and low, cut through the silence. What is this? It was the alpha, but he wasn't speaking to Elian. He was speaking to himself, his voice laced with a disbelief that bordered on agony. He reached out a hand, his fingers clad in a black tactical glove, and stopped just short of touching Elian's face. The gesture was hesitant, uncertain, as if he feared Elian might shatter. "The scent," he whispered, his storm-grey eyes locked on Elian's. "It's—" He shook his head, unable to find the word. The logic that had governed his entire existence was fracturing, crumbling into dust in the face of this overwhelming, primal truth. This was not an asset. This was not an objective. This was his. A deep instinctual possessiveness rose up in him, so powerful it almost drove him to his knees again. Protect, shelter, claim. The words were not thoughts. They were commandments etched into his very DNA, now blazing to life. He was Kale, alpha of the Blackwood Pack. He did not bow. He did not yield. He did not feel. And yet, here he was brought to his knees by a scent, by the sight of wide, terrified eyes, the color of pale jade. He had come here to claim a weapon or destroy a threat, but he had found something else entirely, something that would destroy him instead. Kale's world had been built on a foundation of unshakable truths. The strong survive. Control is power. Emotion is a fatal flaw. He had lived by these tenets, had carved them into his soul with the sharp edge of discipline and loss. Now, in a sterile corridor that stank of death, those truths were shattering like glass. He remained on one knee, his body locked in a posture of submission that was utterly alien to him. His mind, the cold, calculating engine that had guided him through countless battles, was screaming at him. Get up, secure the asset, complete the mission. But his body would not obey. His instincts, the primal core of his alpha nature that he had suppressed and mastered for years, were roaring, a caged beast that had finally broken its chains. And it had one singular command: protect. He looked at the Omega before him. The boy, he was barely more than a boy, was watching him with wide, terrified eyes, his slender frame trembling. The scent rolling off him was a physical thing, a force that wrapped around Kale, undoing him from the inside out. It was a scent of impossible purity, of profound vulnerability, and yet it held a strength that brought the most feared alpha in the territories to his knees. It was the scent of his mate. The concept was a myth, a fairy tale told to pack pups, a weakness that had been bred out of the strong. Fated mates were a liability, a vulnerability an enemy could exploit. He had always believed this. It was a logical, practical truth. But logic had no place here. This was not logic. This was a tidal wave of instinct, so powerful it threatened to drown him. Reese's voice crackled in his ear, sharp with concern. "Alpha, what is your status? We've secured the lab, awaiting your orders." Kale's throat was dry. He tried to form a reply, to give the order to sedate the Omega and prepare for extraction. But the words wouldn't come. The thought of treating this being as cargo sent a vicious, protective snarl through his chest. He could hear the confusion of his soldiers behind him, the soft shift of their armor, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Their alpha, the man of iron will, was kneeling before their target. The foundation of their world was shaking, too. He forced himself to move, to rise. The effort was monumental, like lifting a mountain. He stood, his body still thrumming with the aftershocks of the revelation. He looked down at the Omega, who flinched back, expecting violence. The sight of that fear, caused by him, was a blade twisting in his gut. He had to fix this. He had to undo the terror he had wrought. He unclipped his rifle and let it drop to the floor. The clatter of the weapon echoed in the silent corridor, a sound of surrender. His men stiffened, their own weapons rising slightly in alarm. "Stand down," Kyle commanded, his voice rougher than usual. He did not look at them. His entire focus was on the boy. He slowly, deliberately, began to unbuckle the clasps of his body armor. The heavy chest plate, scarred with the marks of a dozen battles, fell away, leaving him in the simple black undersuit. It was a gesture of vulnerability, a baring of his throat in the presence of his mate. He was shedding the symbols of his role, of the mission, trying to show he was not a threat. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it be. The words felt strange, inadequate. The Omega stared at him, his jade-green eyes filled with a confusion that was slowly warring with his fear. He didn't understand. How could he? Kale barely understood it himself. Reese took a cautious step forward. "Alpha, the directive, the council, the directive has changed." Kale cut him off, his voice dropping into a low growl of warning. His gaze did not leave the Omega. Anyone who threatened this being, even with a word, would be met with lethal force. Reese, a loyal and perceptive beta, understood immediately. He saw the shift in his alpha, the primal, possessive fire that had ignited in his eyes. He had never seen it before, but he recognized it from the old legends. He took a step back, raising a hand to halt the other soldiers. "Secure the perimeter," Reese ordered them quietly. "No one enters or leaves this wing. Lock it down. Now." The soldiers, though confused, obeyed their second-in-command, without question. They moved away, their boots crunching on the debris, leaving Kyle and the Omega in a pocket of strained intimacy amidst the destruction. Kyle took a slow, deliberate step closer. The Omega tried to push himself further back, his movements still sluggish from the tranquilizer. "What? What do you want?" the boy whispered, his voice hoarse, fragile. Kale's heart, an organ he had long considered little more than a pump, ached at the sound. "I want—" Kyle started, but he didn't know how to finish the sentence. "I want to protect you. I want to build a world for you. I want to erase the fear from your eyes." The words were too large, too new. He settled for the simplest truth. "To keep you safe." He crouched down, moving slowly, deliberately, as one would approach a startled animal. He was now at eye level with the Omega, who was propped up against the wall. He could see the faint, almost translucent port just below his collarbone, a mark of his captivity. A surge of cold, pure rage flowed through Kale. The Enclave had done this. They had caged this magnificent being, drugged him, treated him like an object. They would pay for it. All of them. "My name is Kale," he said, the introduction feeling momentous. He was giving a piece of himself. He extended a gloved hand, palm up, an offering, not a command. The Omega stared at the hand, then up at Kale's face. He was searching for the trick, the trap. His entire life had been a cage. He did not know how to recognize an open door. After a long, silent moment, he seemed to reach a decision. He flinched as he moved, but he slowly, hesitantly, reached out a pale, trembling hand and placed it in Kale's. The contact was electric. Even through the glove, Kale felt it, a jolt of pure energy, a resonance that sang through his bones. It was the feeling of a circuit being completed, of two halves of a whole finding each other in the dark. He closed his own hand around the Omega's, his touch surprisingly gentle. The boy's hand was small, delicate, yet Kale could feel a faint, stubborn pulse of life within it. He was not just an asset. He was not an experiment. He was real. "Elian," the Omega whispered, his voice barely audible. "My designation is 734, but my name is Elian." Kale held his gaze, his grip on his hand, a silent promise. "Elian," he repeated, the name a vow on his lips. He would burn the world down to keep this boy, his mate, safe. The mission was forgotten. The council, his pack's laws, the entire war. It had all faded into the background, reduced to meaningless noise. There was only Elian. The journey away from Saito 7 was a blur of sensations, each one sharper and more overwhelming than the last. Elian was cocooned in a world he did not understand, moved by forces beyond his control. The Alpha, Kale, had wrapped him in his own heavy cloak, the thick wool smelling intensely of its owner, of pine, wind, and that deep, protective musk. The scent should have been terrifying, a constant reminder of the predator at his side, but instead, it was a strange and confusing comfort. It settled over his frayed nerves like a weighted blanket, muffling the sharp edges of his panic. He remembered being lifted. Kale's arms were strong, unyielding, holding him against a chest that was solid and warm. It was the first time Elian had been held in his entire life, and the contact was so profoundly alien that his mind simply refused to process it, retreating into the lingering fog of the tranquilizer. He was aware of moving through darkened corridors, of the cold night air hitting his face for the first time, a shock that made him gasp. The air was alive. It was thick with the scent of damp earth, of distant wood smoke, of living, breathing things. It was nothing like the sterile, recycled atmosphere of his room. It was chaotic and beautiful, and it made him want to weep. They traveled on foot for what felt like hours, moving through a dense forest under the light of a shattered moon. Kale moved with a silent, tireless grace, carrying Elian as if he weighed nothing. The rest of the black-armored soldiers followed, a silent phalanx of ghosts in the trees. They did not speak to him, did not even look at him, their focus entirely on their alpha and the strange, precious cargo he carried. Elian drifted in and, out of consciousness, his mind a chaotic swirl of new input, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the call of some nocturnal bird, the feeling of rough bark as Guile leaned against a tree to rest. Each sensation was a revelation. He was a library that had only ever contained one book, and now an entire world of literature was being thrown at him at once. They finally stopped in a hidden cave, its entrance obscured by a thick curtain of ivy. A fire was started, its light and warmth a welcome comfort against the encroaching chill of the night. Kyle gently set him down on a bedroll near the flames, his movements careful, deliberate. Elian curled into himself, watching the alpha from beneath his lashes. The other soldiers had set up a perimeter outside, their voices low and tense. They were confused. Their mission was to secure an asset or eliminate a threat. Their alpha had done neither. He had claimed it. Kale removed his gloves now, revealing hands that were calloused and scarred. He filled a canteen with water from a filter pack and knelt before Elian, offering it to him. "Drink," he said. His voice was still rough, but the hard edge of command was gone, replaced by a quiet insistence. Elian hesitated. In the Enclave, he had never been given a choice. Nutrients were administered on a schedule. His body was a system to be maintained, not a person with needs. This simple offer of water felt like a monumental decision. He took the canteen, his hands still trembling slightly, and drank. The water was cold and tasted faintly of minerals, of the earth it had come from. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. Kyle watched him, his grey eyes tracking every small movement. There was an intensity in his gaze that was both unnerving and deeply compelling. He looked like a man who was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "You are Omega," Kyle stated. Not a question, but a confirmation. The word, spoken in his deep voice, sent a strange shiver through Elian. Elian nodded, pulling the cloak tighter around himself. They said I was a new kind, purer, stronger. He didn't know why he was telling him this. The words just came out. They kept me on suppressants my whole life, to keep me stable, to keep you controllable, Kyle corrected, a flicker of cold anger in his eyes, to turn you into a tool. He reached out, his movements slow, and gently brushed a strand of pale hair from Elian's forehead. The touch was feather-light, yet it sent a jolt through Elian's entire body. It wasn't the clinical touch of a doctor or a technician. It was personal. It was intimate. It was terrifying. Elian flinched back, and Kyle immediately withdrew his hand, a flicker of hurt crossing his features before his mask of control slammed back into place. I will not harm you, Elian. You killed them, Elian whispered, the memory of the bodies in the corridor rising in his mind. You killed everyone. Kyle's expression did not change. They were soldiers in a war. They stood between me and my objective. In my world, that has consequences. And what was your objective? Elian asked, his voice shaking. Was it me? A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across Kyle's hard features, making him look like some ancient, unforgiving deity. Yes, Kyle finally admitted, his voice low. My orders were to secure you. And if that was not possible, he didn't need to finish. Bring me his head. The unspoken words hung in the air between them, a ghostly blade. Elian felt a fresh wave of fear, cold and sickening. This man, this alpha, who was now looking at him with such strange, possessive intensity, had been fully prepared to kill him. What changed? Elian asked, the question a desperate plea for understanding. Kyle's gaze dropped to the fire, his jaw tight. Everything, he said, the word raw with an emotion Elian couldn't name. My instincts, they overrode my orders. They overrode my logic. They overrode everything I am. He looked back at Elian, his grey eyes burning with a fire that mirrored the one in the cave. My instincts tell me you are my mate, and my instincts demand that I protect you, even from my own pack, even from myself. Mate. The word was a myth, a fragment from a forbidden text in the Enclave's archives, a biological destiny, a perfect bond between an alpha and an omega. It was considered a primitive, dangerous concept, an evolutionary flaw that led to chaos and irrationality. Looking at the alpha before him, a man who radiated control and rationality, Elian could see the truth of that chaos. Kale was a man at war with himself, his entire identity thrown into turmoil by a scent, by a biological imperative he had been taught to despise. And Elian was the cause. He was not an asset. He was not a weapon. He was a catalyst, a walking, breathing agent of chaos, and he had just been unleashed upon the world's most controlled man. The dawn brought with it a new kind of tension. Kyle had not slept. He had spent the night sitting by the fire, a silent guardian watching over the sleeping Omega. He watched the slow, even rise and fall of Elian's chest, studied the way the firelight played across his pale features, and breathed in the scent that had upended his universe. With every breath, the bond solidified, a living chain forging itself link by link around his soul. His rational mind was still reeling, scrabbling for purchase in a world that no longer made sense. A mate. He had a mate. The very idea was a strategic nightmare. It was a weakness, a vulnerability, a single point of failure. His enemies, the Enclave and the rival packs, would see it as such. They would see Elian not as a person, but as leverage, a tool to be used against him. And yet, the overwhelming, primal certainty in his gut drowned out the strategic calculus. Protecting Elian was not a choice. It was a biological imperative, as fundamental as breathing. It was his new purpose. His mission parameters had been rewritten by his own DNA. Reese approached him as the first grey light of morning filtered into the cave. His second-in-command looked tired, his face etched with concern. "We have a problem, Alpha," Reese said, his voice low to avoid waking Elian. "The Council is hailing. They know we've gone dark. They're demanding a situation report." Kale's gaze remained on Elian. "Ignore them." "Kale," Reese pressed, using his Alpha's name for the first time in years, a sign of his deep unease. "You can't just ignore the Council. We broke protocol. We abducted the asset instead of neutralizing it when extraction became complicated. They're going to want to know why. They're going to want the asset." The word asset made Kale's jaw tighten. "He is not an asset," he growled, the sound low and dangerous. "His name is Elian." Reese held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I understand, but they won't. They will see a rogue Alpha who has absconded with the enemy's most valuable weapon. They will see a threat." Kale knew he was right. The Blackwood Pack was governed by a council of elders, Alphas, who had survived by being pragmatic and ruthless. They would not understand the concept of a fated mate. They would see Kale's actions as a betrayal, a dereliction of duty driven by some inexplicable madness. They would send hunters. His own pack would hunt him. "And the Enclave?" Kale asked, his voice cold. "They won't just let their prize go," Reese confirmed. "Our scouts picked up aerial drone activity less than an hour ago. They're sweeping the sector. They know the general area we're in. Hunted. By both sides. The enemies he had made and the allies he had just betrayed. All for a boy he had met less than a day ago. He should have felt fear. He should have felt regret. He felt only a cold, hard resolve. Let them come. He looked over at Elian, who was beginning to stir. His eyes fluttered open, jade green and still clouded with sleep. He looked small and fragile against the rough bedroll, a stark contrast to the brutal world that was now hunting him. He saw Kale and Rhys talking, and a flicker of fear crossed his face before he suppressed it. He was learning to be brave. A strange, fierce pride swelled in Kale's chest. "We move at dusk," Kale said, turning his full attention back to Rhys. "Strip our gear of all pack identifiers. We're ghosts from now on. Our destination is the dead zone. Not even the drones can get a clear signal there." Rhys's eyes widened slightly. "The dead zone? Kyle, nothing survives there. The radiation, the chemical storms—" "We will," Kyle said, with absolute certainty. "It's the one place they won't think to look. We can lose them there and figure out our next move." Rhys studied Alpha's face, seeing the unshakable determination there. He had followed Kale through fire and blood, had trusted his judgment when all seemed lost. He did not understand what was happening, not truly, but he understood loyalty. He gave a sharp, single nod. "As you command, Alpha." He turned and left to relay the orders, leaving Kyle alone with Elian once more. Elian had pushed himself into a sitting position, watching Kyle with a quiet, analytical gaze. He had heard everything. "They are going to hunt us," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Kale confirmed. "Because of me." "Because you are with me," Kale corrected him. "The choice was mine." Elian hugged his knees to his chest, making himself smaller. "Why? Why would you trade everything? Your pack, your safety, for me? You don't even know me." Kale considered the question. The simple answer was instinct. But that was not enough. It was more than just a biological urge. In the few hours he had known Elian, he had seen a resilience, a quiet strength that the Enclave had failed to extinguish. He had survived a life of absolute isolation and sensory deprivation without breaking. He was more than just a powerful Omega. He was a survivor. "The world I come from, it's built on the idea of strength," Kyle began, his voice thoughtful. "Strength is control. Strength is power. Strength is the absence of weakness. We fight the Enclave because their control is unnatural, but we replace it with our own brutal version of it." He looked at Elian, his grey eyes softening, almost imperceptibly. "But being near you, it feels like a different kind of strength. Not control, but connection. It's not a weakness, Elian. It's a force more powerful than any army. My pack, the Council, they've forgotten that. They see you as a weapon or a liability." He paused, the admission costing him. For a moment, so did I. I was wrong. Elian listened, his expression unreadable. He had been raised to be an object, his value defined by others. First as an asset to the Enclave, now as a catalyst for Kale's rebellion. The idea that he could have inherent worth, that his very existence could represent a form of strength, was a concept his mind struggled to grasp. "I don't know how to be that," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to be anything other than what they made me." Kale moved closer, settling on the ground in front of him. He didn't touch him, but his proximity was a comfort, a shield against the vast, terrifying world outside the cave. "Then we will learn together," Kale said, his voice a low, steady promise. "You will learn how to be free, and I will learn how to be worthy of protecting you." The promise hung in the air, a fragile, impossible thing. They were two broken pieces from opposing worlds, one forged in brutal freedom, the other shattered by sterile control. And now they were bound, together, hunted by everyone, with only a desperate, instinct-driven alliance to protect them. The dead zone was aptly named. It was a vast expanse of skeletal grey trees, rust-colored earth, and an unnerving silence. The air tasted of chemicals and decay, and a perpetual, sickly yellow haze hung in the sky, obscuring the sun. Here, technology failed. The complex chemical composition of the air and the latent radiation from old world wars played havoc with electronics. Drones could not fly, comms were reduced to static, and tracking signals vanished into the ether. It was the perfect place to disappear. It was also a perfect place to die. For 3 days, they traveled through this desolate landscape. Kale pushed them hard, his senses on high alert, while Reese and the 2 other loyal soldiers who had chosen to follow him, a quiet pair of twins named Saran and Lyra, formed a protective perimeter. They were a pack of 4 now, exiles. Elian struggled to keep up. His body, accustomed to a life of sterile inactivity, screamed in protest. His muscles ached, his feet were blistered, and the harsh chemical air burned his lungs. But he did not complain. He watched Kale, saw the tireless, relentless pace he set, and drew a strange strength from it. He was no longer just an asset being carried. He was a part of this desperate flight, and he would not be the weak link that got them all killed. On the 3rd night, a chemical storm rolled in. It came without warning, a roiling black cloud that descended upon the landscape, carrying with it a corrosive, acidic rain. Kyle found them shelter in the lee of a massive, overturned rock formation, a shallow overhang that offered minimal protection. The rain hissed as it hit the ground, and the air grew thick with a sharp, vinegary smell that made their eyes water. Elian huddled in the back of the small shelter, shivering, not from the cold, but from a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Kyle sat beside him, his large frame a solid barrier against the storm. He had given Elian the last of their clean water and a piece of his own ration bar, which tasted like chalk and nutrient paste, but filled his empty stomach. "You're not used to this," Kyle said, his voice a low rumble beneath the drumming of the acid rain. Elian shook his head, wrapping his arms around himself. In the enclave, the environment was perfect. Always 72 degrees, 45% humidity. The air was pure. He gave a small, humorless laugh. "I think I would kill for a breath of that air right now." "That air was a lie," Kyle said, his gaze fixed on the storm outside. "It was designed to keep you weak, dependent. Real air, real weather. It forces you to adapt, to become stronger." "I don't feel strong," Elian whispered, his voice trembling. "I feel like I'm breaking." Kyle turned to look at him, his expression serious in the dim, hazy light. "Breaking is part of it. You were kept in a pristine jar your whole life. Now the jar is shattered. You have to learn the shape of yourself without it." He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small metallic tin. He opened it, revealing a salve that smelled of herbs and pine resin. Without a word, he gently took Elian's hand. Elian flinched, but didn't pull away. Kale's hands were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he examined the scrapes and cuts on Elian's palms from a fall earlier that day. He began to clean the wounds with a strip of cloth and antiseptic, his movements efficient and practiced. "The enclave. They told me my scent was a weapon," Elian said quietly, watching Kyle's hands work.
They were designing a dispersal system. They said I could pacify a city, end a war without a single shot fired. Kyle paused, his grip on Elian's hand tightening almost imperceptibly. They would have made you a god and kept you in a cage. Is that what you see me as? Elian asked, his voice small. A weapon you can use against them. Kyle finished cleaning the last cut and began to apply the soothing salve. His gaze lifted, meeting Elian's. His grey eyes were clear, unwavering. When I first received my orders, yes, that is what I saw. A strategic asset. A tool. His thumb brushed over Elian's pulse point. A slow, deliberate caress. But when I saw you, when I smelled your scent, I didn't see a weapon. I saw the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking. Elian felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a stark contrast to the cold fear that had been his constant companion. He didn't fully understand Kyle's words, but he understood the sincerity in his eyes. He was not being lied to. This fierce, dangerous man was showing him a vulnerability that felt more intimate than any physical touch. The storm raged outside, a symphony of destruction, but within their small shelter, a fragile peace began to settle. For the first time, Elian didn't feel like Subject 734, the prized experiment. He didn't feel like the catalyst that had torn Kyle's life apart. He just felt like Elian, a boy with scraped hands being cared for by an alpha who had defied the world for him. He leaned his head back against the rock, his shoulder brushing against Kyle's. He expected the alpha to stiffen, to pull away, but he didn't. He remained a solid, warm presence at his side. "Kyle," Elian said, his voice soft. "Yes?" "Thank you." Kyle didn't reply immediately. He finished bandaging Elian's hand, his work precise. Then he looked out at the storm again, his profile stark and grim. "Don't thank me yet," he said, his voice low. "We're not safe. We're just hidden. And they will not stop looking for us." He was right. The moment of peace was an illusion, a brief respite in a war that was far from over. Both the Enclave and the Blackwood Pack were relentless. They would scour the earth for their missing property and their rogue alpha. Sooner or later, they would be found. And when they were, this fragile connection they were building would be put to the ultimate test. The reprieve lasted for 2 weeks. In the toxic heart of the dead zone, they found a place to survive. A network of old-world service tunnels, dry and shielded from the worst of the chemical storms. It was a grim, subterranean existence, but it was safe. During that time, a new dynamic formed among their small, fractured pack. Reese, ever the pragmatist, focused on logistics, rationing their dwindling supplies and planning potential escape routes. Soren and Lyra, the silent twins, became their eyes and ears, scouting the surrounding wasteland with a preternatural skill. Their bond so deep they seemed to communicate without words. Kyle was their anchor, the unshakable center of their group, but his focus was singular. He was teaching Elian to survive. He showed him how to read the subtle shifts in the wind that signaled a coming storm, how to find clean water, how to move without making a sound. Each lesson was a small act of defiance against the Enclave, a dismantling of the helpless asset they had tried to create. Elian, in turn, was a surprisingly quick study. His senses, so long suppressed, were now hyper-aware. He could smell trace chemicals on the air long before the others, could hear the distant slide of loose rock that signaled a predator or a patrol. He was not a warrior like Kale, but he was becoming a survivor. His body grew leaner,
stronger, the soft lines of his former life replaced by a new, hard-won resilience. The bond between them deepened in the quiet moments, in the shared silence of a night watch, in the simple act of Kyle redressing the bandages on his hands, in the way Elian would instinctively move closer to the alpha's warmth as they slept. No grand declarations were made, none were needed. Their connection was a living thing, growing in the dark, nurtured by shared hardship and unspoken understanding. But their sanctuary was temporary. One evening, Lyra returned from a scouting mission, her usually placid face grim. "They're here," she said, her voice tight. "On the eastern ridge. Not Enclave. It's a pack hunter. I recognize the markings. It's Varin." Kale's entire body went rigid. Varin. Of all the hunters the council could have sent, it had to be him. Varin was Kale's rival, an alpha of equal strength and ambition, but where Kale's ruthlessness was tempered by logic and a code of honor, Varin's was born of pure, sadistic cruelty. He didn't just defeat his enemies, he broke them, and he had always coveted Kale's position as alpha of the Blackwood pack. "He's not here for me," Kyle said, his voice a low growl. "He's here for him." His eyes found Elian. Varin would see Elian as the key to Kale's downfall. He wouldn't kill the Omega. He would capture him, use him as a pawn to destroy Kale's reputation and seize control of the pack. "How did he find us?" Reese demanded. "No one can track us here." "He didn't track us," Kale said, his mind already racing, calculating odds and planning strategy. "He anticipated me. He knows I would come to the one place no one else would dare. It's exactly the kind of move he would expect from me." Panic, a familiar cold hand, gripped Elian's heart. He was the cause of this. He was the weakness Varin would exploit. He saw the grim look on Kale's face and knew that the Alpha was thinking the same thing. He had brought this danger to them. "We can't fight him," Soren said quietly, speaking for the first time in days. "Not him. And he won't be alone. His entire unit will be with him." "We don't have to fight him," Kyle said, his grey eyes glinting with a hard, dangerous light. "We just have to outthink him." But even as he spoke, a new threat emerged. A high-pitched whine grew in the distance, a sound that cut through the chemical haze, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the dead zone. Reese looked to the sky, his face pale. Drones. Enclave drones. How? "They must have developed a new shielding technology," Carl cursed, his fists clenching. "They're triangulating our position." They were caught, pinned between two implacable enemies. Varin's hunters closing in on one side and the Enclave's technologically superior forces on the other. A pincer movement with no escape. This was it, the end of their desperate run. Reese and the twins looked to Kale, their faces grim but resolute, ready for their Alpha's final order. But Elian stepped forward. He was trembling, his face pale with fear, but his eyes held a new, unfamiliar fire. "No," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "You've all been fighting for me. Now, let me fight for you." Kale turned to him, his expression a mixture of surprise and fierce protectiveness. "Elian, no, this is not your fight." "It is my fight," Elian insisted, his voice rising with a strength he didn't know he possessed. "It has always been my fight. The Enclave made me. Varin wants to use me. My entire existence has been defined by what other people want from me." He took a deep breath, his scent beginning to fill the small space of the tunnel. Not the scent of fear anymore, but something else, something powerful and resolute. The Enclave said my scent could pacify a city. They thought they could control it, weaponize it, but they never truly understood it. It's not a weapon of control. He looked at Kyle, his jade eyes pleading for him to understand. It's a weapon of truth. It amplifies. It clarifies. It doesn't force an emotion. It reveals what is already there. To those with peace in their hearts, it brings calm. To those with conflict, it brings chaos. Kyle stared at him, beginning to understand the terrifying, beautiful potential of what Elian was saying. When Elian's scent had hit him in that corridor, it hadn't created the bond from nothing. It had merely unlocked the primal truth that had been dormant within him. You want to walk out there? Kyle's voice was rough with disbelief and terror. You want to face both of them? They both want the asset, Elian said, a grim determination hardening his features. Let's give it to them. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a person, and for the first time, he was choosing his own role in this war. He would be the spark that ignited the powder keg, and he would pray that the man he had come to trust could survive the explosion. The air on the ridge was electric with tension. Below, in a small rocky basin, the two forces converged. Varin and his hunters, a dozen hardened alphas and betas from the Blackwood pack, moved with predatory confidence from the west. From the east, an Enclave recovery team advanced, their white and grey armor a stark contrast to the rust-colored landscape, their movements precise and mechanical. They were two apex predators closing in on the same prey, oblivious to each other's presence, their focus solely on the prize. And in the center of it all, standing alone on a flat, exposed rock, was Elian. He was a small, pale figure in the vast, desolate landscape, clad in the dark, practical clothes Kale had given him. He looked fragile, vulnerable, the perfect bait. From a hidden position in the rocks above, Kyle watched, his entire body a knot of coiled tension. Every instinct screamed at him to run down there, to snatch Elian away, to hide him from the coming storm. But he had agreed to this. He had agreed to trust him. Reese and the twins were positioned nearby, their rifles ready, but they all knew that 4 soldiers stood no chance against the combined forces below. Their survival depended entirely on Elian's impossible plan. The two groups saw him at the same time. A murmur of triumph went through both units. The prize was here, undefended, waiting to be claimed. Secure the asset. The Enclave commander's voice, metallic and amplified, echoed across the basin. He is ours, Varin snarled, his voice a guttural roar. The traitor's pet belongs to the pack. Both sides began to advance, breaking into a run, a race to be the first to reach the Omega. Elian closed his eyes. He shut out the sight of the converging armies, the shouts, the sound of boots on gravel. He reached inward, to the core of his being, to the power the Enclave had cultivated but never understood. He let go of the fear. He let go of the doubt. He let go of the lifetime of control that had been imposed upon him and released his scent. It was not a gentle bloom this time. It was a wave, a psychic and pheromonal shockwave that erupted from him, washing over the entire basin in an instant. It was the scent of night-blooming jasmine and rain-washed stone, but amplified 1,000 times, carrying with it the raw, unfiltered truth of his own soul, his pain, his hope, his defiance, his love. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. For the Enclave soldiers, whose emotions were chemically suppressed and ruthlessly controlled, the wave of pure, concentrated emotion was like a sledgehammer to their psyche. Their rigid discipline shattered. The raw fear they had been conditioned to ignore surged to the surface. The buried anger at their sterile existence, the hidden grief for their lost humanity. It all came roaring back at once. They faltered, their advance breaking. Some clawed at their helmets, screaming. Others simply dropped their weapons and curled into a fetal position, overwhelmed by the sudden, agonizing return of their own feelings. For Varen's hunters, the effect was different, but no less devastating. They were creatures of aggression, ambition, and pack loyalty. Elian's scent amplified what was already there. Varen's sadistic cruelty, his lust for power, his jealousy of Kale. It all intensified into a blinding, blood-red rage. The loyalty of his soldiers, already strained by his tyrannical leadership, fractured under the pressure. Their own ambitions, their own resentments, their own territorial instincts were magnified until they could no longer be contained. A hunter next to Varen suddenly turned, his eyes wild, and snarled, "The pack should be mine." He lunged, not at the Enclave, but at his own alpha. Varen, consumed by his own amplified rage, met the attack with a roar. The Blackwood pack hunters devolved into chaos, their rigid hierarchy collapsing as a dozen powerful alphas and betas turned on one another, their personal grievances and ambitions fanned into an inferno of violence. The basin became a maelstrom of chaos. The Enclave soldiers were lost in their own personal hells, and the pack hunters were tearing each other apart. It was a symphony of destruction, conducted by a lone Omega standing on a rock. Elian swayed, the effort of the release draining him, a trickle of blood running from his nose. He had sown the wind, and he was now watching the whirlwind. Kale moved. Now, he commanded into his comm. This was their chance. While their enemies were tearing themselves and each other apart, they would slip through the cracks. He broke from cover, running down the slope toward Elian, his movements swift and sure. He reached Elian just as the Omega's knees buckled, catching him before he hit the ground. Elian sagged against him, his body limp with exhaustion, his breathing shallow. "Did it work?" he whispered, his voice faint. Kyle held him tight, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked at the chaos below, at the self-destructing armies. "You were magnificent," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe. It was terror. It was a love so fierce it burned. Reese, Soren, and Lyra provided covering fire, not at the main forces, but at the few outliers who were beginning to recover their senses. They laid down a suppressing screen of plasma bolts, buying Kale the precious seconds he needed. As Kale carried Elian away from the basin, back towards the relative safety of the rocks, he saw Varen. The rival Alpha had just killed the last of his own loyal men, and now stood panting amidst the bodies, his eyes burning with a mad, pheromone-fueled rage, locking onto Kale. He saw Kale carrying Elian, and a final, guttural roar of pure hatred ripped from his throat. He began to charge after them, a berserker fueled by an Omega's truth. Kale didn't break stride. He kept moving, carrying Elian to safety. "Reese!" he yelled. A single, high-powered plasma bolt, fired with unerring accuracy, struck Varen in the chest. The enraged Alpha stumbled, looked down at the smoldering hole in his armor in disbelief, and then collapsed, his reign of terror ended by a simple, pragmatic shot from a loyal Beta. They disappeared into the rocks as the first Enclave reinforcements began to arrive, finding not their prized asset, but a scene of inexplicable carnage and madness. Kale did not look back. He held Elian close, shielding him with his body, and ran towards an uncertain future, leaving the wreckage of the old world behind them. They did not stop moving for a full day and night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the chaos they had unleashed. They moved east, away from the dead zone, towards the unclaimed territories, the wild and untamed lands that lay between the rigid control of the enclaves and the brutal hierarchy of the packs. It was a no-man's land, a place where only the resilient and the lucky survived. It was a place where they might, just possibly, be able to build a life. They found shelter in a cave system nestled behind a waterfall, the constant roar of the water masking their scent and sound, a natural fortress against the world. Elian slept for 20 hours straight, his body and mind exhausted from his monumental effort. Kale never left his side, watching him, tending to him, his protective instincts now a placid sea after the violent storm of the battle. When Elian finally woke, it was to the smell of roasting meat and the soft light of a fire. Kale was sitting across from him, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, a strangely calming sound. Reese and the twins were gone, out scouting their new surroundings. "You're awake," Kyle said, his voice soft. He put the knife aside and offered Elian a piece of the cooked meat on a strip of bark. "You need to eat." Elian took it, his hunger a deep, gnawing ache. He ate in silence for a few moments, the simple act of replenishing his strength feeling like a victory. "Are we safe?" he finally asked. "For now," Kale said. "Varin is dead. The Enclave's recovery team was incapacitated. It will take both sides time to understand what happened. Time for us to disappear properly." Disappear. The word held a promise and a threat, freedom from their hunters, but also a life of permanent exile. "What about your pack?" Elian asked. "Reese, Soren, Lyra, they followed you. They betrayed everything for you." "They didn't follow me," Kyle corrected gently. "They followed an idea. The idea that a pack can be more than just a weapon, that loyalty can be more than just obedience. They chose this." He looked at Elian, his grey eyes serious. "And now, we have to choose what comes next. We can keep running, or we can build something new, a place for the outcasts, for others like us who don't fit into the Enclave's sterile boxes or the pack's brutal chains." It was a daunting, almost impossible idea. To build a sanctuary in a world that was actively trying to kill them. But looking at Kale, at the quiet strength and conviction in his face, Elian felt a flicker of hope. For his entire life, his future had been a single, straight line, determined by his creators. Now it was a vast, terrifying, and beautiful blank page. I wouldn't know how to start," Elian admitted. "I do," Kale said. "You start with a foundation, with an anchor." He reached across the fire, his hand open. It was the same gesture he had used in the corridor of Saitos 7, an offering, not a command. "Be my anchor, Elian." This time, Elian did not hesitate. He placed his hand in Kale's. The Alpha's grip was warm, solid, a tangible promise in the uncertain twilight. The contact was no longer a shocking jolt, but a familiar, comforting resonance. It felt like coming home to a place he had never been. "I am not an asset," Elian said, the words a quiet declaration of his own hard-won truth. "I am not a weapon." Kale's thumb stroked the back of his hand, his gaze intense and full of a deep, abiding reverence. "No," he agreed, his voice a low, solemn vow. You are the heart of our new pack. The future was a vast, dangerous unknown. The enclave would rebuild. The Blackwood pack would find a new, ruthless leader. The war was not over. But here, in the secluded heart of a wild and untamed land, a new world was beginning. It was a world built not on control or dominance, but on a connection forged in fire and chaos. It was a world with an alpha who had learned the strength in surrender, and an omega who had found the power in his own voice. The roar of the waterfall outside was the sound of the old world being washed away, and in the quiet warmth of the fire, two souls, once destined to be enemies, began to lay the foundations of a future they would build together.